Hi guys, I'm Lily, and I want to talk about sort of a concept that I've been thinking about a little bit. I kind of refer to it as the third-party candidate. Let me explain what I mean by that. From my perspective, and this is something I've been thinking about for a long time now, a couple of decades really, and increasingly I think we live in a G2 world. What does that mean? I think we increasingly have competing spheres of influence. It's pretty clear that the US is a pretty strong country and has a lot of sort of talents with economic, political, military, whatever else around the world. And increasingly, and this has become very apparent recently, that's been true of China, right? I would argue that that's been building for 30 years, potentially longer. And if you just look at the numbers, right, you've got the US used to have 10x GDP, right, in nominal terms. Next year, we're going to be about sort of 50% larger. I say we as an American person, about 50% larger than China. And in 2040, China is actually supposed to surpass the US in GDP. This is in nominal terms. If you look at this in purchasing power parity terms, basically value adjusted for what those dollars can actually buy, China is actually already ahead of the US, right? That's not on per capita. You can go into all sorts of things related to that. But essentially, you sort of have these new poles. About 50 years ago, it was a little bit to the north of China, and today it's pretty apparent that, at least to me, that these are competing spheres of influence. And it's not just economic. Over the last 2 decades, what you've seen is now it's termed as being the Belt and Road, but this has been happening for a really long time, right? About 20 years ago, China started to do a lot of foreign direct investment, also contributing labor into building infrastructure in Africa as a resource-rich and generally economically undermanaged a set of economies. They started doing that 20 years ago. That got into Latin America, Southeast Asia, and then over the last sort of 5 or 10 years, there's been more concerted effort into building infrastructure over what they termed at one point the New Silk Road. Now it's called kind of the Belt and Road through Central Asia and really into Europe. And even here in Europe over the last couple of years, as sort of generations turn over and you have some really fantastic industrial resource and technology and know-how, especially in a country like Germany, you've got a lot of investment coming here, buying controlling stakes, so on and so forth, right? Similar if you go through, originally there was controversy really only about the Spratly Islands. You go into the Indian Ocean, the 99-year lease on the Sri Lankan port, and it really just goes on, right? And so, if you were to go 50 years back and look to see sort of infrastructure, economic, political, military sort of building out of a sphere of influence, and you would see something very similar with what the US did initially in Europe, rebuilding after the war, sort of having containment zones from Japan sort of through Asia, as the US was battling communism, so on and so forth. And I think that there's a form of that which is resurgent, has been building for a long time. So look, there's a lot of little letters on this slide, but the point here is that this is not changing for a country like China. Because China, what I think is underappreciated in the Western world is that China sees itself as having 5,000 years of history. And so anything that happens now, the last 10 years, even the last 50 or 100, is actually just a small blip on the radar screen and potentially part of this large inevitable cycle where China just continues to come back on top, right? So, the top orange bit is China, the blue bit is Europe, America's the green bit, right? Kind of drew out the little lines of things that we sort of are deep in our consciousness, which is take over the Chinese Communist Party about 70 years ago, Opium War before that when China was very weak, and then the US, at least Declaration of Independence, all sort of way right shifted, right? And what's different about sort of the ethnic or the national narrative, and not just sort of folks with PRC passport holders, is that people feel a part of this continuous culture and this language and this geography. And that's something that just really binds over 1 billion people together. And people identify very deeply with the culture and the language and the literature from thousands of years ago in a way which is very different even for Europeans, because when you talk to an Italian, they don't think of themselves as being Roman, right? When you talk to people in Turkey, they don't necessarily think about themselves as being Ottoman. And so that sort of connection with history and the inevitability of sort of of reclaiming the top roost in the world is something which is really, which is very present for 20% of the world's population. And I think that this crowd is probably very aware of the trade-offs that have been made in the name of economic freedom, prosperity, right? So this is a chart showing the number of people as well as the percentage of the population in China that's been living below the poverty line from, I think it's like 1980 up until present, right? There's no other country that has achieved this so quickly on such a scale. And there's been a conscious trade-off, which is to say, for economic freedom, we value stability and prosperity, and the political freedoms is something, if we think about it, we'll think about it later. And that's a value set that has actually sort of achieved happiness for a lot of people. So the other thing that I think about and I see has been happening is, as a short way of kind of phrasing it, is the digital state. And what's been happening is there's been the shift of time, mind share, and money away from the physical economy into a digital economy. And much of that is kind of in a connection between sort of physical goods being coordinated and moved around on the internet, like an Amazon or like an Alibaba is being probably the most prominent examples. But more and more time is going into creating communities, making friends. Probably a number of us have maybe even met each other initially online before even in person here, right? So on just Facebook alone, over an hour a day across the various properties, and then the best-in-class monetization from that, North America, Facebook's probably about $120 a year, about 30 cents an hour. And so if you look at sort of the, purely from like a developing economy standpoint, right, where are people spending time, where are things actually functioning well, you potentially even look at the internet, right, as being the most important and potentially most under-monetized emerging economy out there. And so today it's organized around companies, and I think we've all had a number of things to say about this model and sort of extreme centralizing forces around some very, very successful companies. And then what you sort of have had is, with the introduction of Bitcoin, of course, is the ability to potentially construct these digital economies totally natively, right? Because you have sort of digital scarcity native to the internet. You don't need to have these anchor points in the physical world, and that, to me, really expands the possibility way beyond sort of the e-commerce and all those sorts of things that we use on a daily basis, such that these are experiments we're running today. You can start to think about new forms of governance, right? Nation states have constitutions, digital states have protocols, a different set of rules, and how do we interact around that? Now, it's clearly very, very early days, but one of the things that I think is interesting about this is it's not just about sort of payments and how you custody your money. It's also, in a way, about having a voice, right? Way back when, if you wanted to leave the state in which you were bequeathed or just happened to be born into, it was really expensive. To conduct governance experience was extremely expensive, in the tune of tens of millions, hundreds of millions of lives. And if you sort of take a stretch for a second and think about token, purchase, sale, whatever else, as being a form of sort of exercising your say, well, now we've kind of invented this way that you can unilaterally exit. You don't have to tell anyone. You can basically transfer your wealth, your funds, which is representation of your time and your work, really anywhere you want, right? So you've kind of invented a new form of protest, which is silent, which is unilateral, and incredibly empowering in certain ways. So that's for individuals. And if you think about group exit, we've had a couple of these where there was some bad blood going on in typically a digital space, and you got coordinated group exit. So for example, Bitcoin Cash is an example. So it sounded really nasty at the time, but if you think what's going on, it's actually kind of amazing to me that it's is an individual around 0.1%. And as a community, it's bloodless. So that's actually pretty big innovation. And if you combine that with sort of the economic vitality which can potentially arise in the digital realm, then I think all of this, to me, points towards the formation of these digital states. So why do I call this a third-party candidate? Well, what we've got G2, US, China, and potentially the emergence of the digital state. And typically what happens in sort of multi-party systems, now excuse the American example here, that's one I'm the most familiar with, but as an example, back in 2000, this is highly contentious, right? In Florida, basically the entire election in the next 8 years of the presidency was determined by 537 votes, which was the margin between Gore and Bush. Roll all of that up through the electoral system, and then we know what happened from 2000 to 2008. And so, Ralph Nader has been running for president for God knows how many years. He pulled almost 98,000 votes, and exit polls show that at least, 38, call it about 40% of those should have gone to Gore, right? So this guy had no chance of winning the election, but as a third-party candidate, he pulled just enough away from who was supposed to, was likely to win the election, and actually threw it in a completely different direction. So third-party spoilers, basically the idea is that when you have the third-party candidate, they can weaken incumbents such that, depending on your view, maybe the less optimal candidate is the one that prevails. So what does this mean for us? Something I think about is, the incumbent is clearly the US right now. What I'm concerned about is that the biggest loser from the potential rise of the digital state, if we get there, is actually the United States, and I really wonder if we're actually better off. I think that open systems are a greater threat at this point in time than closed systems because the narrative is open, because discourse is open, criticism is open, and you don't have as well curated of that narrative. Today, the Web3 world is a loose collection of individuals whose collective influence, frankly, just pales in comparison to that of nation states. And even if we think we sort of win on the core values that kind of brought us all here, which is, some of the traditional ones I hear is, USD hegemony. Okay, great. What's the alternative? Is it Libra? Is it the Chinese yuan? Because they're certainly trying, right? Part of the whole idea of the Belt and Road is to create a currency zone which does not require USD settlement, right? Okay, so great. If we don't have any more unlawful spying on our citizens from the Western governments, that we can have that discourse in. There's plenty of countries in the world where it's just legal, right? And so if we no longer have the long arm of the U.S. government sort of, prosecuting FIFA, and sort of bring a lot of folks somehow, somewhere into the U.S. judicial system, partially because of the use of the dollar, then what's the alternative? To me, that's the tri-party game that I think we're actually in. And I think that there actually is a scenario where we get all of these things and we win with all of these things, but we still don't necessarily win overall. One thing I try to think about in response to that is how can we get 1 billion people, right? How do we get a critical mass of people to actually really adopt these values around decentralization, self-determination, and privacy? How do you get people to value that? Because a lot of it is abstract. Privacy is the avoidance of some disaster, and most people don't think about that every day, right? And how do you get people to sort of choose a different value trade-off versus, stability and economic freedom, and start to value and really, actively pursue a greater set of values? Those are some of the things that I think about and sort of hope to help advance in this world. So that's it.